Hello, my name is Stefan Sweigel. I am doing the video presentation for class IRLS611. Professor's name is going to be Dr. Gladell. And the very first part of the prompt is it's asking for an introduction that explains the purpose of the simulation and the importance of the topic. So the purpose of simulation is an exploration in efficacy of Track 2 diplomacy. It's being compared to Track 1 diplomacy. For information's sake, Track 1 diplomacy is going to be discussions, not so much discussions, but working towards a resolution, working towards conflict mitigation, ceasefires. It's discussions between people that can enact the law or work with those who will put the law into effect. Track 1 diplomacy can be seen, I believe, back in the late 1990s between General Musharraf, then President Musharraf, and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was there, I believe, as well. And those were discussions, I believe, if I remember correctly. I used to live there, by the way. I lived in Islamabad, Pakistan from 1998 to 1999. I actually lived there during the military coup. They were about at that time, Taliban that were in the local area and in Afghanistan. It was working to mitigate conflict, but more or less securing national interest in what the U.S. could provide in order to get the Pakistani government to help protect the United States' interest. It's a discussion between figureheads at the highest level, right? It doesn't always have to be the highest level. It can be anyone in the government. Track 2 diplomacy is not going to yield the same effects in terms of legislator directly as Track 1 diplomacy. Track 2 would be more discussions about community leaders, so people that work in the church, business owners, teachers, people that have a direct impact on a smaller level, but not so much to where they could actually enact the law. It's an informal discussion about, hey, where are we at on how we feel? What are the things that are going on in your life that make you feel this way? It's an informal discussion. Doesn't necessarily bring about a direct impact. That's the point of it, is to see where we are at in terms of Russia and Chechnya. Now, the importance of the topic. In current times, yeah, it's pretty applicable. Back in the 1990s, definitely applicable. In the early 2000s, it was most certainly applicable. And the reason I say this is when we're looking at an Islamic caliphate or an Islamic extremist or secular government or rebels or separatists that are actively trying to take over a nation and or influencing a nation, it is disconcerting to me as a U.S. citizen. It's disconcerting to me as an airman. It's not really been something that historically has worked out very well. The importance of the topic, personally, is we're exploring how do we mitigate extremist populations from polluting that local area. It's a difficult discussion to have because if there is a religious component, you don't really want to eradicate that. That wouldn't be right from a democratic standpoint. But if there's terrorists involved, whether it's the United States, whether it's Europe, whether it's Russia, anywhere else in Asia, South America, you have a vested interest in understanding the conflict that's going on over there. More currently, I believe it was mentioned in one of the discussions that the Boston Marathon bomber, both of them were actually Chechen. And that is a little bit disconcerting. So understanding this from an American's point of view it hits home pretty hard for me, being that I lived through September 11th. I remember I was cognizant for it, enlisted. I remember the Boston Marathon bombings. It's pretty important. But from a humanitarian standpoint, the supposed or suspected atrocities that have occurred or are occurring in Chechnya are always worth note. People should not be tortured and or marginalized to the degree that we have discussed in our discussions. But concurrently, Russia is not that far off the power curve here, in that they are actively or were actively trying to pursue a similar goal to that of the U.S. as seen and as read in the simulation with how President George Bush Jr. Had handled his diplomatic relations with Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. So next we have a discussion of what you knew or suspected going in. You may discuss relevant readings to address the topic. So we kind of already segued into that. Insofar as Chechnya and Russia, I can be honest and say that I did not know a whole lot about this going into the simulation. There were a few readings that talked about the emerging states that broke off from the Soviet Union, and looking at them as a blank slate and seeing how IGOs, international government agencies like the UN, could work to mitigate lower conflict or less severe conflicts between nations. They don't really have a blueprint or a historical reference. But insofar as what we discussed in the readings, not really a whole lot was going on before the simulation. And from a personal standpoint, I did not know a lot about Chechnya. I knew a little bit about Russia, but not their conflict per se. So you may discuss readings that address the topic. If you'll give me 1 second, I got to pull it up right here. So there are several things that are going on here that relate to the readings. The very first one that I have here, it is one of the first readings we had from the very first week. It's an article by Collins. Let's make sure, Randall Collins. And the page in here that I'm looking at on Collins' article, which is titled "See Escalation, De-escalation, a Theory of Time Dynamics of Conflict." I've actually been referencing this quite often throughout the course. It really does make things a lot easier to break down. So we're going to go to, looks like, figure. That's 6. There we go. So figure 7 on page 9 of Randall Collins' See Escalation, De-escalation showed side A and side B that talks about the conflict driving process. So with conflict, you have conflict that drives group solidarity, which in turn is going to drive more conflict. But going down from conflict as well, there are atrocities. And when you're reading the article by Randall Collins, most of these acts of atrocity, they're more chest puffing than they are, and then this is in terms of numbers, not in terms of occurrences. So it's more in terms of chest puffing, of talking badly about the other side, but in terms of it being homicidal or necessarily majorly physical violent, where there's serious, long-lasting harm to acting, most times this happens by accident. He calls it isn't called pedestrian, but he calls it an inadvertent act of violence, right? So when this happens, this again is going to drive more conflict. And because this atrocity, real, perceived, or otherwise, whether they really meant to do it or not, is not really an issue anymore, this leads to ideological polarization, which basically means black becomes more black and white becomes more white. That middle ground shrinks, and people really are going to be grouping at the margins. They're going to be grouping at the edges. And there's not that much room for middle ground than having that mediation or mitigation of conflict, mediation, peace building talks. It's not really going to occur. You're in the process of conflict escalation or re-escalation. Again, so the ideological polarization goes back to conflict. This is a cycle, it goes over and over and over again. But as the conflict ensues, if you want to push your interest upon somebody else, or if another government wants to push their ideologies or their group's wants on another, you need resources, whether it's people, whether it's political power, whether it's military, whether it's finances. You can summarize all these as resources, and so mobilizing material resources is part of that. In order to do that, you're going to seek people that have them. Not necessarily you can have your own resources, but also you're going to want to seek other allies. It's easier to win a battle if you have more people going with you. And on figure 7, this has happened on both sides. And so as this is happening, the conflict, which is in the cycle, is causing more conflict on the other side as well, right? So both sides have ideological polarization, increasing the atrocities by result of numbers, not by intent necessarily, are also increasing. And it says in here in a semicolon, forcing out neutrals. Because of that ideological polarization, you're forcing out neutrals as a result of there being less of a median area. You want people to be upset. You want that emotional charge. That's part of the escalation process. For the de-escalation process, as we scroll down here, so when solidarity fails. So the same, this is going to be on Randall Collins' page 11 of escalation and de-escalation. Yes, here solidarity fails because of avoidance, isolation, and attacks break up the group. Avoidance is really clearly guided, but isolation. So people will feel isolated. I think arguably as a result of the ideological polarization, most people don't want to tend to be on the fringes of things once their emotions calm down. I'm not going to talk about humanity or where they really lie at, but typically when emotions calm down a little bit, the ideological polarization is also going to retract. This is going to cause a break between the conflict and group solidarity. Group solidarity is just group unity. Do we all agree on the same thing? So when the members of the group start feeling isolated in that the conflict escalation did not produce the results that they wanted, this is going to lead to isolation of groups within the group, which is going to detract from group solidarity. Now, when you break this cycle, in theory, the conflict will de-escalate. That's There's a lot more to Collins's article than what I discussed, but those are the two figures that I would go back and forth and back and forth, regardless of the conflict that we're discussing, regardless of the area that we're in, whether it was Israel and Palestine, whether it was Sudan. It didn't really matter. That, in my mind, this chart did hold true for the most part. There are things you're going to miss out on, but it gets the gist of it. Ripeness, let's see here. This article is titled Ripeness and the 2008 Djibouti Eritrea Border Dispute. This one's going to be more discussion about how the Qatari government mediated the Djibouti and Eritrean border dispute. There's a lot of good information in here, and but insofar as how it relates to the the Chechen and Russian conflict, the big thing here that I took away from this was the ripeness theory. So the ripeness theory, in more or less phrasing, states that when the conflict or the issue at hand will be ripe for mediation when the escalation of conflict does not yield the wanted effect, which really means that, hey, I'm doing all this fighting and I'm not getting the desired effect. People are dying, losing resources, and we're still experiencing the exact same thing. We're getting nowhere. So when both parties have that feeling, that is when, theoretically, that the conflict is ripe for mediation. And again, there's more to it than that, but this is just a brief description. This is a very short presentation. The next article that I have here was Intergovernmental Organizations and Interstate Conflict, Parsing Out IGO Effects for Alternative Dimensions of Conflict and Post-Communist Space. This does apply, because this is, Chechnya is definitely post-communist space. It doesn't mention Chechnya in here. It mentions more Bosnia and Herzegovina than anything else. And the big takeaway from this, if you want to go to the very bottom, you can. I read the entire article, but it hits it pretty well here in the conclusion. So the idea here was that they were testing out whether IGOs or intergovernmental organizations such as the UN, whether their involvement is going to be highly correlated with mitigating conflict. They're saying that seems to be the going belief, and they are testing that theory out in here. And I don't really have the time to go into the statistics of it. I do understand it, but I just don't have time for it. What they found here was that when they broke it up between severe conflict and not moderate but weaker moderations of severe conflict, disagreements more or less, not necessarily violent on a large scale, they found that IGOs were not as effective at mitigating severe conflicts, and there was more to it than that. But one of the ideas was, in terms of IGOs and doing simulations like what we're doing now, is that when you have these conversations, you have the potential to find out commonalities. But if you're learning more about somebody else's culture and or their standard operating procedures, for lack of a better phrase, then there's also likelihood that the negative can happen as well, or the opposite. and that you find out that there are more things that you don't really agree with about that culture, about those people, about that nation. And so that's also a possibility. So what they found here was is that the results were ambivalent in terms of uh, IGOs mitigating severe conflicts, um, and the results were a little bit they read to be a little bit more highly correlated in the IGOs mitigating severe conflicts, but the results about increasing moderate to weakened states of conflict were definitely ambivalent. And I hope I didn't repeat myself. So, and one of the discussions that they mentioned here for further research was whether the accumulation of increased lesser cases or lesser instances of conflict, disagreements, if that led to more severe disagreements. So that seemed definitely applicable. No, not so much on that. That is simulation. Peacekeeping. So this article is entitled Peacekeeping, Peace Culture, and Conflict Resolution. This is going to be by Tom Woodhouse, and I have the page here. So just bear with me for 1 second. So in here it talks about multiple things. Big thing here that it discussed was peace culture. And with peace culture, it also talked about viewing conflict mitigation or viewing conflict resolution through a cultural lens, which it hits on in the title as apparent. And this, okay, here we go. So this is the one I'm looking for. So a peace culture is going to be defined by a root metaphor. And the root metaphor is a more emotive or more connotative way of stating we need to think about how we feel about the word peace. And here it talks about a feeling of a shared set of values that are appropriate and they work towards wanting peace between nations. However, it's a little bit contradictory because if we're viewing things through a cultural lens, cultures are inherently different even within the same regions, so that becomes problematic. It makes sense and it doesn't. So the Tom Woodhouse discusses that in order to understand the conflict from both sides, there needs to be a cultural lens on the situation, and viewing from a lens of cultural understanding. A good example would be when I lived in Pakistan and India, and when I went to Afghanistan when I deployed. You did not want to shake with your left hand for sanitary reasons. They use the bathroom, they wipe with their left hand. Or when you cross your legs and you show the bottom of your foot to the person sitting next to you, it's very disrespectful. Or if you felt so inclined to throw a shoe at somebody, again, it goes to the reference of the bottom of the foot. And in terms of, I guess if you're to have multiple sexes there doing the mediation, the women wearing the shawls and the chemises is a sign of respect. And so how this plays into the mediation process, if you have two dissimilar cultures, let's just say a Western nation like us, and you have, let's just use Pakistan, that's what I know, and you were to have a female go and meet them, one, from a cultural aspect, they don't view equality in the exact same terms as we do. Some of that's religious, some of that's just learned behavior, I believe. So one, that would be one issue. Two, if she didn't cover her head, that'd be another issue. And this covering the head relates across all three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's a sign of respect. In Christianity, it's more in the Old Testament, which is why it's more Judeo than it is Christian. And more times than not, the Quran and the Torah will have a lot of similarities, even down to dietary laws. It's crazy. But long story short, if there were these little things that the mediators and or the negotiators in a track 2 or track 1 diplomatic effort were to make, it could detract from the negotiations. And so having that cultural lens on there is very important. However, when it discusses peace, the idea of the root metaphor for peace culture, the shared idea of peace culture, there are things you can draw in terms of similarity just from religion. between, the West or the United States and Pakistan. I'm not saying that they're all homogenous, but you could. But also understanding that the cultural implications of the non-conscious movements could detract from it and ultimately cause issues down the road. The last thing I want to discuss here, and I got to make sure I'm doing okay on time, is I'm at 20 minutes. Well, we're just going to keep on. We're just going to keep on rolling. So the last one we'll discuss here was the humanitarian intervention as a responsibility to protect. So here, and discuss it in the discussion forum as well, that we go over internal and external sovereignty and how it's an issue. Sovereignty used to be viewed before the 1990s as a right. I'm sovereign, therefore I govern my people and I govern my borders. Now, the move is to RTP doctrine, or right to protect doctrine, and that you are sovereign to govern your borders and your people so long as you are actually fulfilling that role. And it gets into social contracts. We're talking about Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and the government's role to fulfill its social contract to its people, lest a state of nature chaos is going to ensue. Meaning, contractually, if the government is not working to provide that structure and that protection to its people to avoid that anarchy, then by relation, they're not going to be at a point to where they have that sovereignty anymore, because contractually, by social contract, they have broken it. The next part of the prompt that we have here is going to be a discussion of critical factors that contribute to a successful resolution of conflict. There are many different theories. So what I'm going to do is actually read you my discussion post from week 7. I briefly go over internal and external sovereignty and how there's an issue between them and how they're viewed classically, and how we're making that move towards a restructured idea that makes the idea of non-intervention and humanitarian intervention, it makes more of a middle ground for it. It makes it less dichotomous or categorical. So the first principle I have here is conflict intervention the very first principle should be we need to analyze the type of conflicts that exist between the actors. For here I say, namely Russia and Chechnya. So we're looking at the differences between, whether it's internal or external sovereignty that's in question. If you understand whether it's an issue of borders or issue of governance, it's going to determine how you need to intervene. So if it's an issue of borders, that's going to be synonymous with conquering the land. That would require more military action. If it's internal sovereignty that's an issue, you would seek, hopefully nonviolently, to go in there and try to offer advice. If those talks fail, then you see something more like Iraq, which didn't really work that well, to where we go in with the military, clear out the government, attempt to restructure the government, and give them a blueprint, provide them aid, provide them military training so they can protect their own borders, and hope that they come to a fruitful conclusion. So once the categories were properly analyzed, the mediators would need to figure out which theories or standard operating procedures would work for conflict mitigation. So the reason for this is using the right tool for the right job. So I have here, for instance, a nonviolent approach to genocide would be inappropriate. Conversely, utilizing the military for public relations might not be advised, as people would be scared. That's going to be more the second principle. The third principle here is going to be conflict intervention would be to assess implicit or explicit bias in mediation party might have that affect the intervention. Trust is a huge issue, it seems, between people that are having major conflict. So when that's an issue, you need to make sure the mediator does not have anything on the record that could cause either party to not trust them. The fourth principle would be that a member from the opposite party would be assigned to the opposite party, whose sole job is to provide cultural background to the opposing party, and not necessarily to really get any kind of end goal, but just to put a name to a face, a person toward an act, to associate the person with the action, so that if there's military action that takes place and it is an issue that is something that's more inadvertent, i.e., showing your foot, showing the bottom of your foot to somebody, shaking with the left hand, not covering your head, not following, 3 paces behind your husband, name something, right? Then they can have that cultural understanding to know, okay, well, this is how their culture works. It's not meant to be an insult, so I need to take that into account. And if it gets to that point to where they want to take that military action and it requires the violent action against the opposing party, they're going to have, hopefully, assuming mental state is all well, there's going to be some association between the military action and the children, the women, their daily routines, what they do, what they eat, where they hang out, their religions, all these things. It adds humanity to the situation. Fifth principle would be setting forth consistent aid, be it monetary resources or otherwise, for the immediate future and probability of sustained aid in the hopes of aiding future peace-building operations. So most times war is expensive. War is expensive, especially between second and third world countries and other countries that have money. Even for the countries that have money, it's still expensive. It costs trillions and trillions of dollars over the years. So you want to offer that aid to take one of those stressors out so they're less likely to pull the trigger, per se. This would take a concerted effort from NGOs, IGOs. It would take everybody pulling their resources, whether it's monetary, training, oil, whatever they need to make sure it's one less thing they have to worry about. And the caveat to this would be that if any sort of malevolent acts were taking place under the guise of good faith, an imposing trade tariff, and or certainly military action would be imposed on both nations, and the restructuring process would take place without the input of the current actors' representatives. That last part of the caveat there is not from the readings. That's just my take on how we would deal with that. Discussion of lessons learned from the simulation. I think it pretty keenly hit on that in the past 30 or so minutes. Big thing here is that I was not aware of the atrocities that had occurred in Chechnya. That was the biggest takeaway for me. And the different theories of de-escalation, de-escalation, of the right for mediation theory. Those are all great bits of information that I've added to my knowledge, and I greatly appreciate them. In terms of simulation, I felt myself getting more into the simulation than I thought I would. When I was writing in character, I could feel kind of that, hey, you've got the Russian government behind you. You can make these very passive but very powerful statements saying, hey, you need to stop talking. Even though the point of the whole two-track diplomacy deal was to not increase stress. A discussion of how you'd recommend things be done differently. I'm not entirely sure if that's going to be the simulation or how things have been done between the governments thus far. This is going to be a bit of a controversial answer. So even the wrong plan implemented swiftly is better than an ambivalent plan that is implemented slowly, or it's not indefinitely. I'm paraphrasing and drawing from a bunch of people who I can't remember right now, not my words. But essentially, it's better to make a quick action decisively, even if it's the wrong one. Because if you make the wrong one, then from that point on, you can work on the restructuring process actively. So if I were to look at this in a vacuum and say what Russia should have done differently, if I were Russia, if you're going to want to secure a nation's interest and you're going to do it for utilitarian reasons, then do so pragmatically with a disproportionate military response. But do it once. Don't keep on doing it over and over again. It's costly. Your constituents are not going to vote you back in the office, and you're going to eventually create, potentially, radicalized factions as we're seeing, or as we have seen, in Chechnya. For Chechnya, if sovereignty was such a large issue, from the readings from the simulation and from the background information that I have, it doesn't seem as though it was adequately and exhaustively portrayed that was something that they wanted. It is and it isn't. Whenever the issue was a little bit clouded at the end there towards the end of the simulation, where they were examined, or they were given the title of republic, but they were still constitutionally bound to Russia. It's at that point I'd say, hey, no. And it sounds like they did. There's not really a whole lot more different they could do aside from severely and decisively ending and cutting ties and getting rid of the jihadists or the radical Islamists that have caused the fragmented government with Aslan Maskadov, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. It definitely detracted from his perceived control of the nation. And he might have been the right person to have in there, but we'll never know now because the government fragmented. It's decentralized. Um, and I hope that I've answered the questions succinctly. And I know that I've gone way over my time. I am encroaching on 30 minutes. But I hope I've answered all the questions. Thank you.